everybody. Happy Thursday. Nice to see you all. I'm Rachel Scheinerman, the editor of My Jewish Learning, and this is your Thursday morning 30-minute dose of Talmud. This morning, we are joined by Rabbi Abigail Halpern, who is zooming in from London today, though she is normally based in Germany, and she's going to give us a quick tour through the last week in Daf Yomi. Go ahead, Rabbi Halpern.
All right, thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to learn with all of you. So I'm going to put a link in the chat to the source sheet, and then I'm also about to share my screen. So that's the link, and I'm going to share screen. Sorry, give me just 1 second. Share screen. And while I figure out the screen, okay, nope, that's the wrong one. Here we are. Share. All right. Can you all see that okay? I can't see any of you.
That's right, but your screen is sharing properly.
Excellent. I'm just going to see if I can drag this over to the next window so I can see everybody else. Nope, I can't. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect. Now I can see people and you can see my screen. Excellent. Best of all worlds. All right. So we're going to talk about something a little bit obscure this week. Also, I have a tendency to talk fast because I'm excited about Torah and I'm working on speaking more slowly. But if you catch me speaking at a speed that is not ideal for you, just give me a ping in the chat. The growth area. Okay. We're going to be looking at a kind of two-part story from the daf that was on last Thursday. And I picked it because I think it is very easy to jump over the agricultural law pieces in Kiddushin because there is so much juicy stuff happening. But I think that the agricultural law pieces are actually about things. They're not just kind of rigid halachic categories that maybe don't apply in our regular everyday lives. There's also really interesting, juicy stuff happening. And if you are a regular Daf Yomi learner, you would have noticed that there were several pages about, among other things, kilayim, which if you don't know what that word is, you're about to, so hold on, among other things. And I don't want it to get short shrift, so we're going to spend some time on it. Okay. If you're not a regular Daf Yomi learner, you're about to hear some stuff about kilayim. So kilayim is essentially the prohibition on mixing diverse kinds. And there are 3 ways in which that applies, which we can see from, there are 2 sources for it. In the Torah, I brought you one of them from Leviticus, which is, you shall observe my laws. You shall not let your cattle mate with a different kind. So i.e. crossbreeding different species of animal. You shall not sow your field with 2 different kinds of seed. So that's planting 2 different kinds of crops in one place. And you should not put on cloth from a mixture of 2 kinds of material. And the word used in the Torah for the cloth made from a mixture of 2 kinds of material is shatnez. That might be a word you heard before. That's used to refer to wool and linen blends specifically, which many observant Jews have a practice of avoiding. And the sugya we're going to look at, the piece of Talmud we're going to look at, is focused on the middle one from this verse, the sowing your field with mixed kinds of seed. So i.e., I'm a farmer, and you have to forgive me, I don't know anything about real agriculture. I only know about it in the Talmud. But if for some reason I decided it's a good idea to plant my field with a mix of corn and barley, like all mixed up together, that might be a problem. That's kind of the case that this would be. And we're going to look at what I think is a really interesting sugya, in part because it is an anecdote, and it's not just an anecdote of rabbis. It's not just Rabbi A overheard Rabbi B say to Rabbi C. It's the rabbi was actually doing this, and then he explained why he was doing it. So we have these very active participants. Okay, I'm going to read this to you. Oh, and Lynn, I see some gardeners plant radishes and carrots together in the same row. You might not have to stop. Hold on. The actual applied laws of this, I'm not as confident about, but this is a really exciting sugya. Every single sugya is exciting, but I'm going to try to sell you on this one being exciting. So Rav Yosef was mixing diverse seeds and planting them. And just so you have context, you might be familiar with this, you might not. The way it works is that this translation is from Sefaria, originally from Quran publishers. The Aramaic and Hebrew are very terse languages. And so the way they do this translation is the bold words are direct translations and the non-bold words are extrapolation to clarify and make the sparse text more comprehensible. So Rav Yosef was mixing diverse seeds and planting them. Okay, hold up. I thought that was a problem. Abaye said to him, Rav Yosef and Abaye are famous study partners. They're chavrutas. They learned they're buddies. So Rav Yosef was mixing diverse seeds and planting them. Abaye comes up to him in his, back garden. Abaye comes to visit, sees him in the back garden, says, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah that mixing diverse kinds is prohibited outside of Eretz Yisrael by rabbinic law? I.e., Rav Yosef and Abaye live in Babylonia. They don't live in the land of Israel. But Abaye says, isn't there a prohibition, even if it is not a Torah level prohibition, which is a more severe prohibition on planting mixed seeds, there's still a rabbinic prohibition, which is a slightly lower level prohibition in terms of seriousness and punishment and stakes. So Abaye says, isn't this still forbidden, even if it's not as seriously a problem? Rav Yosef said to him, this is not difficult. I.e., no, this isn't a problem. You quoted a Mishnah, which is an earlier kind of rabbinic text, but that's actually not, my case isn't what the Mishnah is talking about. I'm totally behaving reasonably. So as here, the Mishnah is referring to diverse kinds in a vineyard, i.e. the Mishnah that Abaye is quoting is saying, oh, there's really interesting stuff. Okay, the Mishnah that Abaye is quoting, Rav Yosef says, no, that Mishnah that says it's forbidden to plant mixed kinds outside of the land of Israel only applies in a vineyard. Something about the nature of planting in a vineyard heightens the stakes. But there, in my own case, in my back garden, I'm planting legally. There's no problem because I'm planting only diverse kinds of seeds and I'm not in a vineyard, which would be higher stakes and forbidden. Okay, yeah, Saul, Rav Yosef is blind if he is mixing. Yeah, that's a really good question, right? It can be very easy to just think of the names of the sages in the Talmud as really interchangeable, but who they are as literary characters and what we know about them really enriches what's going on. And I don't have, a tidy answer to how did he know that he was mixing, but it seems like he is aware, like on purpose, planting on purpose. And my friend Rabbi Lauren Tuckman, who I was actually recently looking at this same sugya with, is one of the first blind woman rabbi ordained in at least American Judaism, I believe, in the world. And she was also pointing out to me that one of the powerful things about this story is this is a case where we see a blind person just being a totally active participant in the world, and it's not assumed that they're unable to participate. Can I speak more slowly? Yes, and thank you so much for asking. I really appreciate it. Okay. So now we're going, so the reason, so we're in the middle of Rav Yosef's explanation to Abaye. Rav Yosef is saying, yeah, these texts often are informed by ableism, and that's a huge underlying factor, and we're going to actually get at that a little bit more in a bit. So first things first, Rav Yosef said, the Mishnah that Abaye quotes that says that planting diverse kinds is a problem, that's only about a vineyard, and we're not in a vineyard. Because with regard to planting diverse kinds in a vineyard, which in Eretz Yisrael is prohibited even with regard to deriving benefit, hold that concept, the sages issued a decree prohibiting this mixture outside Eretz Yisrael as well. So there's Torah level prohibitions for consuming something. There's rabbinic level prohibitions for consuming something. Those are different levels of severity. But then there's a more intense kind of prohibition, which is a prohibition to even consume something. Or to even benefit from something at all, even if you're not consuming it. A good example of this is for people who keep kosher, according to traditional halacha, it is even if I don't eat bacon, it's completely fine for me to buy bacon dog treats and feed them to my dog. And I mean like real bacon, not just bacon flavor. Because pork is only forbidden for eating. But according to traditional halacha, meat and milk is a combination that is not only forbidden for consumption, it is forbidden for benefit. So I could not buy dog treats or kibble or any of this. My parents have 2 dogs, so this is the example that comes to mind, that is a mixture of meat and milk, because that's a form of benefit. So that's the distinction between a more intense prohibition that involves benefit. It comes up a lot with regard to the temple as well. But kashrut is a more familiar example, probably. Okay, so in the land of Israel, can you explain at some point how this relates to the topic of Kiddushin? That is a great question. Yes, we're going to finish off this sugya, and then I'm going to connect it to Kiddushin. Thank you. I'm seeing there's a lot of gardening wisdom in the chat, which I'm appreciating. Okay, so in the land of Israel, it is super extra radioactive forbidden to plant mixed seeds in a vineyard. Whereas it's only regular prohibited to plant mixed seeds not in a vineyard. And then you leave the land of Israel and everything kind of levels down a step. So conversely, with regard to planting diverse kinds of seeds, which in Eretz Yisrael is not prohibited with regard to deriving benefit, i.e. just planting regular seeds mixed together, not in a vineyard, the sages did not issue a decree prohibiting them outside of Eretz Yisrael. So essentially all the prohibitions, they just shift down a level of severity outside the land of Israel. And so Rav Yosef is saying to Abaye, I can plant these mixed seeds because there is no prohibition on planting mixed seeds not in a vineyard outside of the land of Israel. If it was in a vineyard, that would be rabbinically prohibited outside the land of Israel. It's a little naughty, bear with me. Okay, then something incredibly, incredibly interesting happens. Rav Yosef then said, so Rav Yosef was talking, you might expect the next statement to be from Abaye. Rav Yosef walks back the statement he just made, which I personally found very clear and compelling. I thought that was a great read. It was a clear argument. It adheres to all the normal principles of rabbinic argumentation. But Rav Yosef then said, the matter that I said, i.e. that diverse kinds of seeds are not entirely permitted outside of Eretz Yisrael, is not so. Because actually, maybe I'm wrong. The proof is that Rav, an earlier sage, who was also living in Babylonia, importantly outside the land of Israel, planted the garden around the study hall in rows of different species. What is the reason that he did that rather than plant different species together? I.e. they have a garden outside the Beit Midrash, imagine a shul garden, for decorative purposes maybe, and you plant all the tomatoes in one row and all the basil in another row, instead of mixing them. And so it seems like, anecdotally from this story, Rav is of the opinion that you can't plant mixed kinds together, even not in a vineyard outside of the land of Israel, because he was careful to plant them separately. So Rav Yosef, who just made this textual argument, is like, but there's a story that I am familiar with, that maybe that he witnessed, that makes him walk back his textual analysis. Okay, now we hear back from Abaye, who, remember, initially was opposed to Rav Yosef planting mixed species together. Abaye said to him, that is not proof, i.e. the story that you're using to doubt your own initial argument, Rav Yosef, is not good proof. This Rav anecdote doesn't teach us that there is a problem planting mixed kinds outside the land of Israel. Granted, if he taught us this halacha through his actions, so if this story actually is a proof, he was careful to plant 4 different species along the 4 sides of the garden bed and 1 in the middle, so that there would be space between them, it works out well. This would show that Rav was cautious not to plant diverse kinds together, right? If the way that Rav was planting things was really in a very particular formal way to separate things really strongly, that might be evidence. But here, in the actual case that actually happened, Rav actually planted each species in its own bed. He did so due to beautification, i.e. it's just nice to have that corner be tomatoes and that corner be basil. Alternatively, the reason Rav planted this way is due to the trouble that it would be caused to the attendant. I.e., if I say to someone working for me, go get a tomato, it is much easier to say the tomatoes are in the far right corner than to say the tomatoes are mixed in everywhere. So there are plausible reasons that this story that Rav Yosef is using to doubt his initial proof that it's okay to plant mixed seeds is actually not evidence that there's a problem. Okay, I want to pause. I want to pause and drink water. I want to pause and, Laura, relate to your question, which is, I think, a really big question. Okay. On a very technical level, the reason that we end up talking about kilayim in Tractate Kiddushin in this wonderful classic way for the Talmud is that the initial chapters of Mishnah, the earlier rabbinic text that the Talmud is elaborating on, starts listing things that it's associative. And initially we're talking about differences between men and women. We're talking about different levels of obligation. And then we get into talking about different kinds of mitzvot that are different from each other. And the Mishnah, which is from around the year 200, which is, yes, exactly, Rob. It's about a lengthy section about the difference between mitzvot in and out of the land of Israel that we sort of got to, but initially by talking about differences between other different kinds of mitzvot. But I think it is also very interesting that Kilayim is in this tractate, because Kilayim has its own tractate of Mishnah as well. It doesn't get a tractate of Talmud, but it gets a tractate of Mishnah. But this lengthy discussion of Kilayim in Kiddushin is interesting because so much of Kiddushin is about boundaries between people and dissolving boundaries between people. We have men and women, we have married, unmarried, we have all of these rigid categories that we're kind of seeing break apart and come back together, and in really fluid, knotty ways. And I think it's interesting that this is all another genre, or another category of rabbinic text. No, it's another category of Jewish law that is also about really concerns about divisions and distinction. And so thematically, I think it's very consistent. And I think this topic can say a lot about how the rabbis are thinking about distinction and division. And how we read about Kilayim can say a lot about how we think about distinction and division. Lynn, maybe it's another commandment about having an organized life, right? There's a certain kind of regulating your life. I want you to hold that because that is so relevant to this next piece. Okay, I have brought you an incredibly dense piece from an academic book about Talmud. We are going to go really slow. It is out of context. I can guarantee you there are going to be things in this that you are not going to understand, just like Talmud requires a lot of context and is hard to understand. And because I could not bring you an entire book, I actually have the book because I'm still finishing reading it. But we're going to go slow and we're going to pull out some ideas together. So this is from a book that was just published this year by the Talmud academic at the University of Michigan, Rafe Neese. And this book is called When a Human Gives Birth to a Raven. And it's about the rabbi's relationship with animals, concepts of animality, draws from the academic field of animal studies, which is very interesting, and thinks a lot about what are the differences between humans and animals and similarities as they've been historically understood throughout time. And they have a whole chapter about Kilayim. And we're going to have to do some mapping work because this is mostly about animal crossbreeding Kilayim and not plant crossbreeding Kilayim, but I think that it is still relevant. So I'm going to read through nice and slow and explain as we go. Okay. There is a particularity to Kilayim that is not reducible to the mere idea of all kinds of formal or substantive difference that come to be juxtaposed any old way, multiformity, or to some notion of mixture of previously pure categories, even if those are socially constructed. I.e., Neese is cautioning us against reading these statements about mixing or not mixing as being extendable, as being about some kind of rabbinic way of thinking about distinction and difference and mixing. We should actually start to try to see Kilayim locally in its own context. It is important to let go of imprecise notions of hybridity so that we do not inadvertently smuggle in ideas that were broader than or different from those held by those in late antiquity themselves. Okay, when we read these texts, it's very easy for us to think about, for example, how we think about plant mixing today. And plant mixing is, I think, the least politically loaded of the different kinds of social interaction combination that we can have. Like, if you've ever eaten a nectarine, that's technically Kilayim. Because it's a peach and a plum? I don't know. But it's a peach and a something. It's a peach and a plum. Rachel is nodding. I believe you. And there's no prohibition, remember, on consuming it. So there's zero Jewish problem with that for anyone, no matter your framework. But this is not necessarily about, right, good or bad, right? We can eat a nectarine. There's nothing wrong with that. Maybe you can't do the grafting to make the nectarine tree. Okay, next point. Second, but no less crucially, okay, this here, Nice is about to talk back to a concept that I was unfamiliar with and that probably most of you are unfamiliar with, but they are saying something interesting even if they are arguing against something maybe none of us ever thought about. I aimed to undo the inadvertent reification of a very specific 18th/19th century derived biological notion of hybridity, one that unwittingly reifies a normative natural law essentialist idea of originary, pure, and distinct species that the hybrid threatens to corrupt. Okay. In less complex language, there is a kind of early scientific idea, right? Think about Darwin organizing all of the species, that there are pure kinds of species, right? You can say, this dog is a poodle, this dog is a Labrador. We're going to breed them, and that's a Labradoodle, and that's a mutt. Right? So the concept of dividing the world into those species, that's a constructed way of understanding the world, and it has a history. And when we read the rabbis talking about crossbreeding, we shouldn't assume that they're thinking about species and different categories in the same way that we would necessarily categorize things in the world, which we might do based on, for example, do they share DNA? Where do they sit? And, the science class chart of this worm is over here and this worm is over here, but we can trace them back to this earlier worm. The rabbis weren't understanding the world that way. And so we shouldn't understand necessarily hybrids, mixing, kilayim, as threatening some kind of, the idea that there are hybrids should not be considered, we should not make it part of a way of understanding the world as divided only into pure categories and corruptions of pure categories. It's much more complicated than that. Okay, here's a really interesting piece. These modernist understandings of hybridity, i.e. the Darwin kind of, they're a pure species and then they can be mixed, carried over into biological and scientific racisms and in turn shored up ideas of racial purity and eugenics that are difficult to prize apart from modern and contemporary notions of intermarriage or mixed marriage. That is very loaded. I'm just going to flag that that's very loaded. These ideas have a history. This clarifies my purpose in attending to the historical and concrete particularities of hybridity as they were expressed over time by Palestinian rabbis. The Palestinian rabbis thing is about specific texts that they look at elsewhere in this chapter. Fine. Okay. Third point. Third, I attempt to avoid an overly rigid understanding of prohibition in general. And Lynn, this gets back to what you were saying about ordered life, as something that is essentially and necessarily moralized, i.e., Nice is cautioning against saying, oh, the rabbi said X thing is prohibited. That must mean they thought it was ethically bad. There is every reason to understand prohibition as a productive force shaping behaviors and worlds, rather than as purely a force of restraint or negation. Okay. Just because something is prohibited or constrained or limited, as Nice says, is not a reason to assume that it is bad or wrong. And this is, I think, very interesting because this is in some ways a sort of classic modern approach to talking about Jewish law. That, oh, it has no moral valences. It's actually just about like serving God through the technical details. And here it's being brought by a very theoretical academic thinker in a totally different context. And I think that's very interesting. And I think that there's something about, to go back to Lynn, your comment about having an ordered life, that an organized life, in your words, there is, I'm just looking back up. There is something about what are the ways in which we're kind of sorting things in our lives in a way that can be non-morally and non-judgmentally weighted? And how can we appreciate the structures that Judaism and other things are offering our lives without things necessarily being bad? My friend Lainey Solomon, who teaches at the Queer Yeshiva Svara, was saying, the rabbi said to me yesterday, I was like, yes, this is brilliant. The rabbis hate binaries, but they love boundaries. And I thought that was a really important distinction, that being boundaried is different than having binaries, because hybridity, the concept that there's something mixed, means there's A and B, and it comes together to make C. And I think that what's happening in the sugya we looked at is there's a real challenging of this sort of black and white thinking. It says, actually, this kind of thing is okay and this kind of thing isn't okay. It depends on the context. It depends where you live. What is a binary in this context? For example, this is a plum and this is a peach, and I'm going to breed them together. And we know that there are pure plums and pure peaches, and then we have this kind of chimera of a nectary. How does this help the rabbis maintain social order? Yeah, some modern scholars have suggested that part of the entire rabbinic project that's happening in the Talmud is by organizing the world and creating laws and creating definitions, the rabbis are kind of creating a social and cultural world in which they have power. And historically, it's very debated how much actual power the rabbis of the Talmud had. And we're talking about a massive historical period within the rabbis of the Talmud. So that's also fluctuates. But within the textual world of the Talmud, the rabbis get their authority by creating categories and then challenging those categories. And that's, I think, I just want us to, through looking at Kilayim, think about the ways in which the Talmud is engaged in this constant process of creating categories and then nuancing those categories and making them split into finer and finer pieces, and how that makes us think more critically about binaries and boundaries in our own lives.
Thank you, Rabbi Halpern. It's interesting. The Talmud, the Mishnah is organized in 6 orders, right? And the first order is all the agricultural laws, and there is almost no Talmud on it, right? We have, I don't know how many tractates in the Mishnah, and only Brachot, the very first one, gets Talmud. And so we did that in 60 days at the beginning of Daf Yomi. And then we won't really get an in-depth Talmudic discussion of that. So I appreciate that you brought our attention to it, because we aren't going to get a full sustained tractate on this. And in a nod to the holiday that is coming up, because it's that season when, if it's not a holiday today, it probably is tomorrow. So happy early Sukkot to everybody. I just thought I would add one more text here, parting text for everybody. I put it in the chat. I didn't have a source sheet prepared. I didn't prepare this, but this is from the Mishnah in Bikurim, which is part of those agricultural laws that we'll never get to in the Talmud because they never wrote Gemara on them. And this is about the etrog, and it talks about how the etrog is kind of like a fruit, but kind of like a vegetable. So since we are, if you can take a look at that on your own. There is a debate. One rabbi, I believe, thinks that it is basically a fruit, but there's also another opinion that it is kind of a fruit and kind of a vegetable, that the boundary between what's a fruit of a tree and what we treat as a vegetable in terms of the laws, there's also an intermediary space there. We are out of time for today. So lovely to see you all. I hope you all have a beautiful Sukkot. We will see you in the middle of Chol HaMoed Sukkot next week for our next review. Thank you, Rabbi Halper, and thank you to all of you for the participation, especially those of you who bring lots of gardening wisdom to the chat and explaining the advantages of interplanting to us. And we will see you all next week. Thank you, everyone.